Barbara Walters once said, "The most revealing thing about a person isn't what they tell you, it's what they refuse to." Richard Lewis spent a lifetime turning anxiety into art, squeezing laughs from the darkest corners of being human. Whitney Houston had a voice that could stop a room cold. But what people forget is how hard she worked to control it, night after night, city after city. Jeff Beck never explained his guitar. He just played it, and let the silence between the notes do the talking. Loretta Lynn wrote her own songs, fought her own fights, and built a career on sheer refusal to be told no. Tony Bennett kept performing into his 90s because the work itself was the point. The stage was where he was most alive. In 1971, a studio executive handed Clint Eastwood a script called "Play Misty for Me." The expectation was simple. Eastwood would star in it. What happened instead changed the way Hollywood understood him. He directed it himself. He was 41 years old, had never directed a feature film, and he shot the entire picture in under a month, on location in Carmel, California, on a budget so tight there was no room for wasted days. The film worked. Critics noticed the control behind the camera. What nobody fully absorbed at the time was that this was not a one-off experiment. It was the beginning of a working method that Eastwood would apply with remarkable consistency for the next 5 decades. The method starts before the camera rolls. Eastwood has talked publicly, including in interviews with directors like Richard Schickel, who spent years documenting his career, about his deep discomfort with excess preparation time on set. He believes that over-rehearsal kills the spontaneous quality that makes a performance feel true. He does not mean he is unprepared. The opposite is the case. He arrives with the material fully inside him. What he protects is the aliveness of the first or second take. His standing instruction on most productions is that the first take is often the one that goes into the cut. Actors who have worked with him, Gene Hackman, Morgan Freeman, Hilary Swank, Matt Damon, have all described the same experience. You show up ready because Eastwood is ready and the camera is already rolling. That philosophy did not come from confidence. It came from watching waste. Eastwood spent years as a contract player at Universal in the late 1950s, cycling through small roles in forgettable pictures, watching directors burn through time and money on takes that were essentially identical. He was not a star then. He was a tall young man with a good face and no particular leverage. What he had was attention. He watched how sets were run. He watched what happened when a director was indecisive versus decisive. He stored it. The television years on Rawhide, which ran from 1959 to 1965, gave him something even more useful: repetition at scale. 217 episodes. Season after season of performing the same character in front of a camera, learning which gestures read and which ones disappeared, understanding rhythm and pacing not as abstract concepts, but as muscle memory. He was also watching directors, dozens of them over 6 seasons, and developing strong opinions about what worked and what didn't. By the time Sergio Leone cast him in A Fistful of Dollars in 1964, Eastwood was not a raw talent discovering himself. He was a professional who had been training for years in a format that most American actors dismissed as beneath them. What Leone gave him was permission to strip performance down. The man with no name speaks very little. He acts through stillness, through the decision of what not to do. Eastwood has described this as one of the most important lessons of his career, that restraint is not absence, it is a form of pressure. The less you give the audience, the harder they lean forward. He brought that understanding home from Italy and never let go of it. By the time Dirty Harry arrived in 1971, Eastwood was a star by any commercial measure, but the establishment still did not fully respect him. Pauline Kael, among the most influential critics of the era, called Dirty Harry a fascist film. Eastwood did not retreat from the controversy. He has addressed it in interviews across multiple decades. He understood that Harry Callahan was a character with dangerous edges, and he believed the film was examining those edges rather than endorsing them. Whether you agree with that reading or not, the fact that he engaged with the critique seriously rather than dismissing it says something about how he thinks about his work. He is not an artist who pretends his choices are neutral. The founding of Malpaso Productions, which Eastwood set up as his production company in the late 1960s, is often treated as a business footnote. It is actually central to understanding how he works. Malpaso gave him control over casting, over budgets, over final cut in most cases, over who he collaborated with and on what terms. Hollywood has a long history of stars who surrendered creative control in exchange for larger fees. Eastwood did the opposite. He accepted lower fees in certain deals to retain the decisions that mattered to him. The economics of his career are inseparable from the creative choices. He built a structure that protected his ability to say no to things he did not believe in, and yes to things that interested him without asking permission. The films that followed over the 1970s and 1980s ranged widely in tone and quality. There were the Dirty Harry sequels, which varied in their seriousness. There was The Outlaw Josie Wales in 1976, which he also directed and which remains one of the more underrated westerns of that decade. A film about grief and reconstruction, anchored by a performance of controlled devastation. There was Bronco Billy in 1980, a small, affectionate film that showed he was not only interested in hard men and hard landscapes. There was Tightrope in 1984, in which he played a detective whose psychology was genuinely unsettling, one of his most underappreciated performances. And then there was Bird in 1988, a biography of Charlie Parker that had nothing to do with the Eastwood brand and everything to do with his private love of jazz. Music is not incidental to Eastwood. He plays piano. He has composed music for several of his films. His passion for jazz is documented across decades of interviews and public appearances. Bird was a project he fought to make. The studio was not enthusiastic about the commercial prospects of a jazz biography with a predominantly black cast, and Eastwood pushed through anyway. The film was critically praised and financially modest. He made it because he believed in it. That pattern, choosing the project on the basis of his own conviction rather than external expectation, is consistent across his career in a way that is genuinely unusual for a filmmaker of his commercial profile. Unforgiven in 1992 is the film that most decisively reframed him in the eyes of both critics and audiences. He was 62 when it was released. The film won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. But what matters more than the awards is what the film actually does. It uses the Western genre to methodically dismantle the mythology of the Western hero, including the mythology that Eastwood himself had spent 20 years building. William Money is not a romantic outlaw. He is a damaged, morally compromised man doing terrible things for money. The film refuses to make this feel good. Gene Hackman's performance as Little Bill is a masterclass in institutional cruelty, and Eastwood chose Hackman specifically because he wanted someone who could make the antagonist feel genuinely frightening rather than cartoonishly villainous. The years between Unforgiven and $1 Million Baby included work that continued to surprise. A Perfect World in 1993, in which he played a Texas Ranger pursuing Kevin Costner's escaped convict, was a film more interested in ambiguity than resolution. The Bridges of Madison County in 1995 cast him against type as a traveling photographer opposite Meryl Streep, and the film worked precisely because he did not try to make the character cool. He let the character be vulnerable and a little lost. It is still one of his most emotionally open performances. Mystic River, in 2003, marked a significant moment in his reputation as a director. The film, adapted from Dennis Lehane's novel with Sean Penn, Tim Robbins, and Kevin Bacon, was dark, structurally careful, and performed with an intensity that Eastwood's direction amplified by staying out of the way. He did not impose visual style on the performances. He created conditions for them. Penn won the Oscar for Best Actor. Robbins won for Best Supporting Actor. Eastwood was nominated for Best Director. The film is now considered one of the serious American dramas of that decade. Then came $1 Million Baby in 2004, and the pattern repeated itself in a compressed form. The film was not expected to perform the way it did. Warner Brothers was uncertain about its commercial viability. Eastwood made it anyway, on a short schedule, with Hilary Swank in a role that required genuine physical transformation, and Morgan Freeman in a part that asked for sustained, quiet power. The film won Best Picture. Swank won Best Actress. Freeman won Best Supporting Actor. Eastwood won Best Director, again. He was 74 years old. The double release of Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima in 2006 demonstrated something about his ambition that is easy to miss when you focus only on individual films. He made 2 films about the same battle from opposite national perspectives, one American, one Japanese. Letters from Iwo Jima was filmed almost entirely in Japanese, with a Japanese cast. It was nominated for Best Picture and won the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay. For a filmmaker whose early reputation was built on stoic American masculine archetypes, this was a significant act of imagination and humility. He did not assume the American perspective was the complete one. Gran Torino in 2008 generated enormous commercial response. Eastwood starred as Walt Kowalski, a bitter, aging Korean War veteran forced into relationship with his Hmong neighbors. The film's politics are complicated. It has been praised for its portrait of Midwestern white working-class culture and criticized for some of its representational choices. Eastwood has not offered neat defenses of every element. The film exists in the record as a complex object, not a simple triumph. What is not complicated is its commercial success and the specific quality of Eastwood's performance, which used his age, his physical presence, and his established screen persona, deliberately and without vanity. American Sniper in 2014 broke box office records for an R-rated film. Bradley Cooper's preparation for the role of Chris Kyle was extensive. He gained weight, studied Kyle's mannerisms, trained with military advisors. Eastwood directed the film in his characteristic fashion, efficiently, without sentimentality, and with an attention to procedural detail that gave the combat sequences a texture of documentary realism. The film was immediately controversial. Critics on the political left argued it glorified a figure whose record included contested claims. Critics on the right celebrated it as a tribute to military service. Eastwood's own public political views, he has been publicly Republican, he delivered a famously improvised speech at the 2012 Republican National Convention, involving an empty chair. Add a layer of context that some viewers bring to the film. What the film did, regardless of where you stand politically, was connect with millions of people who felt their experience of war and service had been ignored by mainstream cinema. The Mule in 2018 and Richard Jewell in 2019 showed that he had no intention of slowing down in his late 80s. Richard Jewell, the story of a security guard wrongly suspected in the 1996 Atlanta Olympic bombing, was, in Eastwood's framing, a film about institutional power crushing an ordinary person. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution publicly challenged the film's portrayal of a journalist, played by Olivia Wilde, suggesting the depiction was both unfair and factually unsupported. Warner Brothers stood by the film. The dispute is part of the record. Cry Macho, in 2021, had him directing and starring at the age of 91. The film received mixed critical notices, but the act of completing it, a physically demanding production shot in New Mexico with Eastwood in essentially every scene, is itself a document of discipline. He has not spoken publicly about retirement in any serious way. What runs beneath all of it, from Play Misty for Me to Cry Macho, is an approach to time that is unusual in any creative field. Eastwood does not labor over projects for years in development. He makes decisions quickly, shoots quickly, edits quickly. His films are generally delivered on schedule and under budget. This is not because he is shallow. Unforgiven and Mystic River and Letters from Iwo Jima are not shallow films. It is because he has spent so long doing the work that the deliberation happens internally before the camera starts. By the time he arrives on set, the thinking is finished. What remains is execution. He has talked about the physical and psychological discipline this requires. Staying in condition, staying curious, staying willing to take on material that could fail publicly. His record includes genuine failures. Not every film worked. Not every directorial choice landed. But the volume of serious, specific, artistically ambitious work produced over more than 50 years by a single filmmaker, who is also performing in most of those films, is not something the industry has many comparisons for. At 94, Clint Eastwood is still in the conversation. Not because of nostalgia, because the work keeps asking questions that don't have easy answers about violence, about masculinity, about loyalty and betrayal, about what happens to people when institutions fail them. The questions are still live. So is he.